In 1954, Berlin was divided, having become the epicenter of the ideological battleground in the Cold War. The city was ruled more by spies and secrets than the tanks and troops lining its streets. Just a year earlier, in August of 1953, the Soviets had detonated their first hydrogen bomb in their own rapidly advancing atomic project. The West was concerned about what else they might be planning and felt that they had to do something before it was too late. But in order to act, they needed to know what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. It was within this tense atmosphere that the CIA and MI6 conceived a bold plan. They conspired to dig a tunnel from the American sector of Berlin beneath the world's most heavily guarded border and tap into Soviet East German communication lines on the other side. Codenamed Operation Gold, the Berlin Tunnel was to be the world's longest and most high-tech spy tunnel. The operation was, however, doomed from the get-go, being compromised by a senior British MI6 officer who had turned traitor. The early Cold War period saw a transition from the reliance on wireless radio communications to the more secure telephone system. Radio communications were easily intercepted, and ciphers and codes could be cracked, as evidenced during the Second World War. With the development of telephone technology, running long lengths of cable buried underground where it was difficult to reach became more practical and reliable. With sensitive communications no longer being broadcast on the open airwaves, intelligence agencies the world over had to rethink their methods of signals intelligence gathering. Enter the spy tunnel, the construction of which, prior to Operation Gold, was not without precedent. The British had successfully tapped into Soviet telephone cables in Vienna some years earlier. Codenamed Operation Silver, for 6 years the British eavesdropped on the Soviets from within their 70-foot tunnel running beneath Soviet Army headquarters. The operation was forced to end only when Allied-occupied Austria regained its sovereignty after the war. So if it had been done successfully in the past, why not replicate the same thing in Berlin? Well, the primary difference was that the proposed tunnel in this instance would have to span an unprecedented length across difficult terrain. It would also have to pass under the most heavily armed and fortified border that the world had ever seen. The stakes were high, but so were the potential rewards. If successful, the tunnel could provide the West with a near-endless supply of military and political signals intelligence, enough to possibly even tip the balance in the espionage war that was being waged in the shadows of the Iron Curtain. The operation was enabled by a tip-off received by Alan Dulles, the then Director of Central Intelligence, of the existence of a key telephone junction box located near to the border between the American and Soviet sectors in Berlin. It was here that 3 cables buried 6 feet underground converged, and through which travelled thousands of Soviet and East German communications each day. Early planning meetings took place between the CIA and MI6 at No. 2 Carlton Gardens in London. The British Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, brought to the table its prior experience in successfully pulling off Operation Silver. The CIA, on the other hand, was chiefly responsible for footing the bill, which was going to prove rather hefty. Information from the planning meetings was highly compartmentalized, with representatives of the West German government being excluded from the talks due to the risk of their ranks having been infiltrated by enemy agents. Unbeknownst to both the Americans and the British, it was one of their very own men who was the spy in their midst. Attending the planning meetings was an MI6 officer charged with taking the minutes. He just so happened to also be one of the KGB's most trusted double agents. Enter George Blake. Dutch by birth, but having acquired a British passport through his father, who served in the British Army during World War I, Blake was climbing progressively through the ranks of British intelligence. He was yet another upper-middle-class product of Cambridge University, that British institution that managed to produce so many communist spies. In October of 1948, Blake was dispatched to Seoul in South Korea, where his official title was that of Vice Consul at the British Legation. His true mission, however, was to establish a network of agents in North Korea that were to gather intelligence and combat the spread of communist ideology. His mission for MI6 proved near impossible, and Blake fell into a state of disillusionment with what he considered America's fascist puppet regime in South Korea. On the 25th of June 1950, the Korean War broke out, with the Korean People's Army in the north quickly overrunning Seoul. Blake was taken captive, and while being marched with his fellow prisoners through Pyongyang and towards the Yalu River, the destruction wrought by carpet bombing of the US Air Force was of a scale he couldn't have imagined. After reaching his prison camp, Blake immersed himself in the communist writings of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. It wasn't long before his ideological transformation was complete. Having decided he wanted to work against his own agency and country, he handed a note to his captors offering his services as a spy. Blake's offer made its way all the way to the KGB, and he was soon recruited as an agent. Blake and his fellow prisoners were freed from their wartime imprisonment in North Korea in a prisoner exchange after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. By April of that year, Blake was back in England, and he immediately began feeding information to the Soviets. Working for MI6 in London, Blake became privy to the details of Operation Gold after attending the initial planning meetings, passing the details straight to his Soviet handlers. The KGB knew everything: the tunnel's location, its purpose, and the timeline for its construction. But instead of immediately shutting down the operation, the Soviets made a decision to allow the tunnel to be built. Oblivious to the compromise, in 1954, Allen Dulles gave the green light for the project to proceed. A warehouse was first constructed in the Rudow district of Berlin in order to conceal and disguise the construction activities. It took 5 grueling months to dig the tunnel that stretched 450 meters at a depth of 7 meters below ground. The tunnel then rose to intersect a series of cables less than half a meter below a busy street in enemy territory in East Berlin. Every precaution was taken to avoid detection. The excavation was carried out using hand tools to minimize noise, and the soil was discreetly removed and scattered in the American sector of Berlin. The work was demanding, and the risk of discovery was ever present, but the tunnel slowly but surely took shape. At the end of the tunnel, sophisticated listening devices were installed, which were able to intercept the phone lines running to Soviet military headquarters. What made this daring operation all the more intense was that the entire tunnel was rigged full of explosives, designed to self-destruct in the event of its discovery. By the 25th of February 1955, the tunnel was complete to the tune of over $6.5 million. For the next 11 months and 11 days, the West had a direct line into the heart of Soviet transmissions, listening in on countless conversations. Approximately 90,000 individual communications were intercepted, which comprised 40,000 hours of telephone conversations, along with 6 million hours of teletype traffic. The sheer volume of this required a dedicated team of CIA translators and analysts in Washington, D.C. to work around the clock, sifting through the endless chatter in a quest to uncover intelligence gold. Since CIA Director Allen Dulles had ordered that the fewest possible details of the project be reduced to writing, to those in the know, the tunnel was a triumph of Western engineering, cunning, and technology. Yet the CIA and MI6 had no idea that the Soviets knew about every intricate detail before they even broke ground. This was, of course, all courtesy of their man on the inside, George Blake. This could have been a prime opportunity for the Soviets to feed disinformation through its communication lines to bamboozle the West, but it appears that this rarely happened, if at all. Only a small group of men within the KGB knew about the tunnel, and their warnings to the Soviet military to think carefully about what they communicated over telephone was largely ignored. While the Soviets were grateful for Blake, who sent them summaries of the key information the West had learned through its eavesdropping, there was a problem. The Soviets felt unable to act on their knowledge of the tunnel for fear of compromising their valuable agent in place. By April of 1955, a newly married George Blake was even closer to the action, having been posted to Berlin. Rather than risk compromising their agent, the Soviets bided their time, waiting nearly a year until deciding to blow the lid on the operation. In April of 1956, the Soviets discovered the tunnel after heavy rains revealed the cables on the streets of East Berlin. East German and Soviet troops then staged a raid on the tunnel, although not forgetting to alert the press before they did so. The revelation of the spy tunnel was used as the perfect propaganda piece. The USA and the British felt acute political embarrassment when it was revealed to the world that they had been spying. The Soviets understandably took full advantage of the situation to paint their adversaries in a negative light, the USA in particular being their prime target. The Soviets described the tunnel as a breach of the norms of international law and a gangster act. The raid, which had conveniently for the Soviets been attended by numerous journalists and photographers who documented the momentous discovery, was a public relations disaster for the West. The CIA and MI6 had been caught off guard and could do little but watch as their prized operation was dismantled and displayed for all to see. Fortunately, it was decided that utilizing the tunnel's self-destruct mechanism was not a great idea, given that blowing up a number of Soviet soldiers and civilians would likely lead to World War III. Despite its compromise, Operation Gold did yield useful intelligence during its 11 months of operation. It is still not known precisely the extent of the value gained. That said, it is believed that the Berlin Tunnel provided the Western Allies with key insights into the Soviet order of battle strategy, Soviet troop movements, and other military plans. Once the teams of translators and analysts had sifted through the heaps of banal conversations, what was left included key insights into Soviet atomic research, the early warning of the establishment of a Soviet East German army, the poor condition of East German railways, how much resentment there existed between the Soviets and East Germans, and the growing tension in Poland, which would later erupt in 1956. The timing of the discovery of the tunnel coincided almost perfectly with Soviet First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev's state visit to the United Kingdom, just a day before he was to attend a grand banquet with Queen Elizabeth II at Windsor Castle. The tunnel's existence was revealed. There are whispers that behind the scenes, the Soviets and the British struck a quiet agreement to downplay the UK's involvement in the operation. This would explain why the media coverage remained suspiciously restrained, despite the fact that much of the equipment captured in the photographs was unmistakably British-made. It was a delicate dance of diplomacy and deception, one that kept the full extent of British participation hidden from public view, even as the operation itself became front-page news. It was only in 1961, a full 5 years after the operation had been compromised, that the US and British Secret Services discovered that the tunnel had been compromised long before it had even been built. It was only after the defection of Polish military counterintelligence officer Michael Golonowski that the trail of breadcrumbs led Western intelligence to the foot of George Blake's door. After being recalled to London and interrogated, George Blake was finally arrested. Put on trial at the Old Bailey for his crimes in May of 1961, Blake was convicted of his extensive espionage activities on behalf of the Soviet Union and was sentenced to 42 years in prison. This, however, wasn't the end of the George Blake story, for the leaky walls of Wormwood Scrubs didn't contain Mr. Blake for long. But that's another tale, and one which has been covered on this channel. Perhaps the most significant information the West learned from the Berlin Tunnel was what they didn't hear. In the copious volumes of intercepted communications, at no stage was there ever any hint that the Soviets intended to invade or to deliver a nuclear first strike. And so, the story of Operation Gold ends not with a bang, but with the quiet shuffle of boots retreating from the scraping sounds of shovels in a compromised tunnel. It's a story that encapsulates the very essence of Cold War espionage. Bold, brilliant, and yet so easily undone by the invisible hand of betrayal.